to a live stream episode of The Watchdog. This is, of course, the Mint Press show where we watch the watchers. We are reliant on your help as an independent means of communication and media. So please do support us by clicking on like, by subscribing, by sharing, by commenting on this video. Now, we, of course, are on the back of another massacre in Gaza by the Israeli military, where we have seen the numbers climb and daily more people being announced dead following the Israeli campaign against Palestinian resistance forces. However, a mythology which has taken hold and been widely disseminated in the media sphere has been this idea that misfired rockets are responsible for the deaths of Palestinians. Actually, the Israeli military originally claimed that the 5 children who were killed in the graveyard visiting the grave of their grandfather could have been killed by misfired rockets. But just recently, in the last 24 hours, the Israeli military has admitted that it was responsible for these dead children. Also, in addition to that, you've seen the Associated Press, in a very servile nature, join the chorus of what the Israeli military has said, going as far as to state that close to 1/3 of the Palestinians who died in the latest outbreak of violence between Israel and Gaza militants may have been killed by errant rockets fired by the Palestinian side. Well, I did some interesting digging into the writers involved in this article, and what I found is that all 3 of the writers involved in this article, from Tia Goldenberg to Joseph Krauss to the writer which they mention at the end, Ilan Ben Zion, all 3 of these people have worked for the Times of Israel. Some of them currently work for the Times of Israel. Now, the Times of Israel was not only founded, but is also funded by Seth Klarman. Now, Seth Klarman, through his Klarman Family Foundation, funds the Israeli intelligence think tank, the INSS, which is led by former head of Israeli intelligence, and also funds the settler group Elad. Closer to home in rainy England, Seth Klarman also has funded the David Horowitz Freedom Center, which employed Tommy Robinson and even Katie Hopkins. So, of course, this would put major question marks on the any neutrality of the writers of this article for the Associated Press. Of course, we also can't forget that the Associated Press's own office was destroyed by the Israeli military in May 2021. Well, today we are joined by the relentless Alan MacLeod, head investigator at Mint Press. He has looked into not only Facebook but also Google and the influx that we have seen across the last years of former employees of both the CIA, of other institutions of the national security state, into these very, very important platforms and means of communication. We know that the director of global content at Facebook is actually a former NATO employee, goes by the name of Mark Smith. Also, when we look at, say, since 2016, the role that Facebook has played in choking anti-war social media accounts, Mint Presses included, you look at the original accusation being that Facebook actually had some sort of anti-conservative bias. Now, this was pushed widely. At the time, the vice president of global public policy at Facebook was none other than Joel Kaplan, who was not only a lobbyist for the fossil fuel industry, but also formerly part of President George Bush's administration. So the idea that somehow there was an anti-conservative slant to the Facebook algorithms is really laughable. Now, Mother Jones did an investigation into this, and what they actually found was, off the back of this attempt to so-called to supposedly rectify its anti-conservative bias, what you saw was the impressions that went to, say, an organization like Mother Jones, but also Mint Press and also my own Facebook, rapidly declined post 2016. In contrast to that, you saw the algorithms extremely generous to the Daily Wire, which we've gone into in previous episodes. Ben Shapiro led Wilkes Brothers fossil fuel billionaire funded enterprise with close links to Israeli intelligence and, of course, US intelligence, but also the Daily Caller, Breitbart, and Fox News. All of them flourished in this period, and all of our pages as alternative news, as original original sources of information, we all really saw our algorithms suffer massively from that period. On the Israeli side of things, we also know that Facebook employs on its 20-member oversight board Amy Palmer. Now, Amy Palmer was the general director of the Israeli Ministry of Justice at the time that it established the Internet Referral Unit, which took down tens of thousands of posts by Palestinians, which targeted Facebook accounts and got those taken down. Well, today, as I said, she's on Facebook's oversight board. Previously, she'd been on the Israeli National Planning and Building Council, which is responsible for approving the construction of settlements. So there's definitely a lot happening at Facebook, and it seems to be quite a contested space. Now, Alan has done some really peerless research, I would say. He's had a veritable party on LinkedIn looking at these current employees of Facebook. Now, just to start with, I think, and we are joined, of course, by Mint Press's editor-in-chief, Manar Adli, who is going to kindly play us an interview with a gentleman by the name of Aaron Berman. Now, there's something amiss here, but we're not going to spoil the surprise. We'll let Alan explain to us after we see this interview with Aaron Berman.
My name is Aaron. I've been with Facebook for 2 years now. I'm a product policy manager.
What does your job entail?
We're part of the team that writes the rules for Facebook. If something violates our standards for safety and security, what Facebook could, should, can do.
You and your team are faced with very important decisions, especially when it comes to content.
There's very little agreement whether we should be leaving more content up, taking more content down, with any particular rule or issue that we're looking at, where something has come up where the rules are not 100% clear. We're not going to make everybody happy.
How does your team work on that?
Transparency is incredibly important in the work that I do. How do we think about the balance between harmful content and protecting freedom of speech? It's a balance.
Does it ever make you feel uncomfortable to be put in a position where you're having to draw the lines?
Yes, and I think it should make me uncomfortable, and all of us who do this work. If 99% of the people are expressing themselves, sharing their family photos, exchanging ideas, and 0.001% are encouraging violence or spreading harmful content, that can ruin the thing for everybody. These decisions can have real effects on people. We're developing rules and policies without regulation. We're really navigating that space as best we can.
Why would updating regulations help you?
Regulation can help us better define what is acceptable and what's not. I think a standardized approach would help platforms all across the board actually give us guidelines where right now there's very few. Technology has changed so quickly, we need the legislative and regulatory space to catch up. Regulation can help us better define what the bounds of those rules should be.
Thank you, Manar. Well, I must say, I, for one, am quite enamored with the gentle lilt of that comfortable elevator music. It made me feel quite at ease. It made me feel quite a lot of trust. Now, trust is the key word here. Mr. Alan MacLeod, could you please tell us what is amiss with Aaron Berman potentially?
Yeah, sure. I think he comes across as a really lovely person, that lovely purple sweatshirt he's wearing, the as you said, the piano music, the soft lighting. It makes it seem like this is a really good organization. And the fact that Aaron seems to take his job so seriously certainly puts me at rest. Or at least it would if I hadn't Googled him. Aaron is in fact a senior CIA agent, or at least he was until a couple of years ago when he left his post at the agency where he was a senior analytic manager to take a job at Facebook, where, as Facebook itself describes, he is basically the person who is in charge of the team that is deciding what gets zapped off of the platform and what gets promoted. Now, this has huge consequences, not just for media organizations who live and die by the amount of clicks they get on Facebook. And I really do mean live and die. Plenty of them go bust because of changes in algorithms. But it also affects what 3 billion people see in their news feeds, because that's how many people actually get their news from Facebook from time to time, or even as their major source of news and views. And so Facebook really has a power which is truly unparalleled in world history. There has never been a time when 40% of the entire world's population gets its news from one place. And that is what's happening at Facebook. Now, Aaron is not some sort of pen pusher at the CIA. He was actually extremely high up. He was so high up, in fact, that he was writing for years the president's daily brief to President Trump and President Obama. So that is, the document that the president would either read or have read to him every single day about intelligence. So as I said, this is not some sort of minor guy. He was there for years and years. I feel it's a little bit, unfair on Aaron Berman, though, to single him out, though, because in fact, Facebook has hired dozens of CIA agents in the last few years, most of whom have gone into highly politically sensitive fields like trust and safety, or content moderation, or security. Almost none of them have gone into politically neutral or banal fields like sales or marketing or customer service. These are really the people who decide what the world sees and what the world doesn't see. And that is an enormous problem for anyone who really cares about freedom of speech, because that means that this is half a step removed from the most blatant government censorship that anyone has ever seen. And this is happening on a world level, and nobody even knows this is going on.
Well, I was going to say, as you so eloquently put it, he's not only the only former CIA employee working for Facebook, he's not even the only former CIA employee with the name Berman who is working for Facebook. Could you tell us about Deborah Berman? And if you'd care to speculate if there happens to be any type of relation between our friend Aaron and Deborah?
Well, I won't speculate on their relationship or lack thereof. But yeah, Deborah Berman was another Berman that I found working at Facebook, another former CIA employee and analyst. Obviously, it's very difficult to find out a lot about these people. As a rule, people who work in intelligence don't have open social media profiles. They're not in their name. They're not searchable. But from her pre-CIA days, when she was working more in the sort of think tank and university area, she was really a specialist on the Middle East. And it seems that her specialist country specifically was Syria. And this was in the early 2010s, when, of course, there was a dirty war being waged against the government of Syria, which just turned into an entirely, just a complete mess in which thousands of people have died, millions of people have had their lives destroyed. And we talk about it as a civil war, but really it's this sort of global proxy war whereby so many different countries have got their fingers in the pie there, whether it's Russia or Israel or the United Kingdom, the United States, Saudi Arabia. Everybody's really got a piece of the blame to go around there. And so, yeah, the Bermans are just two of many, many examples of former CIA agents I've found working at the higher echelons of Facebook. Some of these people, in fact, not only were they working, at reasonably high positions in the CIA, a lot of them were even working in things like targeting analysis, which basically means they're the sorts of people who decide who gets droned and who doesn't. this is the sort of extraordinary career change which anybody should be aghast at. But so few people even know this is happening. I only know about it because I was actually trying to work out who was actually making these decisions at Facebook and at Twitter and the other big social media companies, because I felt like these are some of the most important people in global media and nobody even knows their name. We often complain about, pointy-headed bureaucrats in Silicon Valley deciding what people should see and what people shouldn't, but it's actually even worse than that. In fact, so many of these people are plucked straight from the national security state and put into these positions. And a lot of the time, they're not even people who've taken a break for a couple of years and have tried out something and then have got into tech. These people are literally, on a Monday working in Langley, Virginia, and then on Tuesday they quit, and then they're, taken out to Silicon Valley in California, and then they're doing this job whereby they're basically controlling global media. Now, I will say that is a problem because, of course, the CIA is, if you could think of any other organization that is less qualified to, sift right from wrong, fact from fiction, I'd like to hear about it. The CIA, of course, has a dreadful record in putting out misinformation and disinformation itself. And that's to say nothing of the global torture program that they oversaw, the gun running and drug smuggling they did in Central America, the coups that they've unleashed all over the world. This is the sort of organization which is about as untrustworthy as it gets. And now they are the ones that are deciding for billions of people all around the world what we see and what we don't see. And we're supposed to just be fine with that. It's incredible.
Well, you alluded to in what you just said was a gentleman by the name of Scott Stern, who, as we see in your fantastic research, he went from being targeting officer at the CIA, he rose to become the chief of targeting, which meant that he was literally selecting targets for US drone strikes, which we have seen from whistleblowers have bravely revealed that 90% of the people that have died in US drone strikes are innocent civilians. So this is, factually a killer. He's now senior manager of risk intelligence for Meta. And misinformation and malicious actors are the key things that he focuses on. Now, the testimony of someone like John Stockwell revealed actually that the CIA is the one of, if not the greatest purveyor of fake news and misinformation in the world. Could you just tell us, it's not only the CIA that seems to be, former employees seem to be all over Facebook, and there's tens of them that you've identified at least in this article, but there's other elements of the security state that have a presence in Facebook. Could you tell us a bit about some of those individuals and what exactly are the institutions that they have come from?
Yeah, as I said, I did find dozens of them, but this wasn't some sort of super detailed research I was doing. What it entails is basically going to employment websites like Rocket Reach or LinkedIn and literally just typing CIA Facebook into it. And if you do that, you will be greeted with hundreds of different people coming up. And dozens of them are clearly real people, and you can demonstrate that by checking them and finding them on websites and cross-referencing them and then looking at their employment history to make sure that these are actually genuine accounts. But I want to point out that this is just the CIA people working for Facebook who have public LinkedIn profiles which identify themselves as as a former CIA. How many people at Facebook do have LinkedIn profiles but have left that part out, or perhaps don't even have LinkedIn profiles at all but do have this history? Surely the number is going to be much greater. But as you said, it's not just Facebook and it's not just the CIA. There are plenty of other organizations within the US national security state that have people in higher echelons of Silicon Valley corporations. You could see, for instance, the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's premier think tank, has a lot of people now getting placed into cyber warfare positions whereby they are essentially charged with keeping us all safe from mis and disinformation, even though the Atlantic Council put out some of the most ludicrous stories about foreign interference in our elections, our society, about how foreign governments, specifically Russia, are secretly propping up political parties like the UK Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, or UKIP under Nigel Farage, or basically any left-wing or right-wing political movement which doesn't fall within the narrow beltways of acceptable left and acceptable right. You'll also see former people from the FBI in higher echelons of Silicon Valley corporations. You might also see people from the Secret Service or the White House or the Department of Defense. This really gets to the point that big companies like Facebook have actually started to think about themselves like governments in themselves, that they are moral arbiters and the definers, the primary definers of what is true and what is false. And for that position, they have been rapidly recruiting a whole load of people from the national security state. And one does have to wonder whether they're doing this completely on their own volition or whether there's some sort of quid pro quo going on. In 2018, for example, we saw Mark Zuckerberg hauled before Congress and the Senate and grilled and read the Riot Act. There were serious people talking about breaking up Facebook and even potentially jailing Mark Zuckerberg for his role in spreading disinformation, which led to Donald Trump's victory. And just a few weeks after all of that, Zuckerberg comes out and announces that Facebook has partnered with the Atlantic Council, which, as I said before, is NATO in all but name. And what that means is the Atlantic Council has significant influence over 3 billion people's news feeds, in particular their digital forensics lab, which purports to be this great independent group of thinkers who really understands how government-sponsored influence campaigns work and are going to keep us all safe. But when you look at their actual output, these groups almost never find any sorts of influence campaigns emanating from Western governments. It's almost always enemy governments that they are particularly interested in. And that starts just smelling like a real bad egg right there, to the point where you start to think, is this entire thing a huge Western-backed influence operation to try to convince us of a foreign-backed influence operation going on? It's like the foxes are offering to be in charge of the hen houses to protect the hens from the wolves. And that's really how I'm starting to think about it.
I mean, there's a few cases actually from your article on this situation with Facebook that stick out to me. For instance, Brian Weisbard, who was a CIA intelligence officer. Part of his job was leading global teams to conduct counterterrorism and digital cyber investigations, also looking at social media misinformation, propaganda, and covert influence campaigns. Well, now he finds himself as the Director of Trust and Safety, Security, and Data Privacy at the sort of mother corporation Meta. I mean, this is quite incredible. Another one which I found very interesting is that the head of insider protection is the formerly an undercover officer in the CIA, Nicole Alford. How can words like trust be anywhere near in any type of proximity to an organization like the CIA, with all of the history of covert action all across the world and wreaking havoc in many different ways? It wasn't just Facebook that you've looked at recently, but actually just before we finish on Facebook, I think it's important that you really break down for us who exactly is Ben Nemo, and what has his role been in other organizations. For instance, the Institute for Statecraft, which has had a role in subverting British democracy.
Well, Ben Nimmo is a British disinformation expert who has had so many jobs in the national security state that it's quite difficult to really keep track. He was, for instance, at one point, NATO's chief press officer. He also worked at Graphica, which is a supposedly private intelligence firm, which also looks at all sorts of things like foreign influence campaigns. That group is funded by the US government and the US military, and it always seems to find that the United States' enemies are being extremely bad online, whether that's China or Russia or Venezuela or whomever. Nimmo is now, well, he also worked at the Atlantic Council, of course, another NATO-linked organization, as we've talked about. And now he's essentially head of intelligence for Facebook. And that really is the cherry on top of the coming together of the fourth estate and the national security state, whereby Facebook is now so closely intertwined with the national security state more generally that it's very hard to see where one begins and the other ends. Because ultimately, Nimmo has been, for the last 10 years at least, one of the key characters in the British government or within the NATO security apparatus. And so ultimately, him going into the private sector and saying, well, I'm going to protect you from all of these things online, it's like, we need protecting against your former employers, mate, and you're not talking about that. That's who we really need being protecting from. Of course, Russian influence and Russian propaganda, it is real, but frankly, it is like a toothpick in a forest compared to what the CIA or the army or the British government or the US government puts out, because we're just exposed to it far more. And so ultimately, we're in a situation where we're being absolutely flooded with propaganda about propaganda, and it's so overwhelming that a lot of people don't even realize it's happening.
I mean, an interesting thing about the sort of connection between Ben Nemo, NATO, Facebook, and the Institute for Statecraft is that the Institute for Statecraft, the supposed charity based in Scotland, which Alan MacLeod knows well, was funded. The Institute for Statecraft was funded by both Facebook and NATO. And actually, the Scottish government came to the conclusion that it really had to step up its game because it didn't seem to be carrying out any charitable purpose. Now, in fact, Institute for Statecraft had a program called the Integrity Initiative, whereby it built these clusters of journalists, which included figures like David Aranovich, like Carol Cadwalader, the patron saint of British liberal media. And there was seemingly coordination between figures from British military intelligence involved in the Integrity Initiative and the Institute for Statecraft and these different journalists in terms of messaging at the same time. So, we've really looked at Facebook, and I would urge everyone to go and check out Alan's absolutely peerless investigation. This is very, very important work that he has carried out and has found, a home for this kind of work at Mint Press. So I would encourage everyone also to support what Mint Press does, because there's literally nowhere else that you will read on topics like this and investigations with this level of depth. I think is also important, we don't forget Twitter, for example. Gordon Macmillan is head of editorial for the Middle East at Twitter, and he is simultaneously in the 77th Brigade, the British Army's psychological warfare unit. We also know that in 2015, Twitter launched the Safety Center and listed a number of trusted partners. Among those trusted partners were not only the Community Security Trust. Now, this is an organization that gets £14 million of British taxpayer funding every year. Michael Gove, actually, at the same time as being Education Minister, gave the Community Security Trust £2 million 1 year, and it was revealed that the same time he gave that money to Community Security Trust, he was on its board of advisors. So that's a clear conflict of interest. It's a sharply pro-Israel organization. It militates against BDS. It has also, according to Anthony Learman of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, and someone who has had experience with the Community Security Trust, it has many of its employees and volunteers trained by Israeli intelligence, according to Anthony Learman. And that is a part of Twitter's safety center. So it's a trusted partner who advises Twitter on what is and what isn't acceptable speech. Another organization that advises Twitter on that subject is the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, which infiltrated many different campaigns and organizations, political campaigns, sold that information to the FBI, to other intelligence agencies. You know, the ADL is the largest non-governmental collaborator with the FBI in the US. But in addition to that, we can't forget that in 1969, an FBI internal memo actually questioned whether the ADL was in violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And the exact FBI memo puts it this way: it is incredible to think that the ADL is not furnished to an official of the Israeli government. So clearly the FBI thought that the ADL was an Israeli proxy, but yet today it's closer to the FBI than ever before. And that's in the words of James Comey, head honcho at the FBI. However, in 2018, Twitter updated its safety center and actually involved the Board of Deputies in the UK as part of this trusted network of partners. Well, the Board of Deputies, in its own trustees report in 2020, put that it has a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy, that it has strengthened links to the Ministry of Strategic Affairs and the Israeli military. So clearly we see at Twitter that there is a serious problem with organizations with close links to the Israeli government having a role there. But really, with Alan, what I wanted to look at was his fantastic study of Google and looking at similar issues around former CIA employees at Google. But I think, you know, it's impossible for us to also not mention the ADL when talking about Google, because it is a trusted partner at YouTube. It's also has this Silicon Valley anti-cyber hate working group, which was funded by Pierre Omidyar from PayPal fame, who made a lot of money at PayPal. Of course, the ADL have another crossover with PayPal where they help to investigate the funding of extremism. But also, in addition to the ADL having this Silicon Valley anti-cyber hate working group where Google is a long-standing member, you also have to look at some of the current employees of YouTube and Google. So you have the head of global reputation marketing for YouTube is someone by the name of Ricky Drury, who is a former IDF communications officer. You also have the lead for product strategy and operations, Naama Citron. She is also a former intelligence officer in the Israeli military. You also have the senior director of product management at YouTube, Dror Orion, who was formerly a senior analyst in the Israeli military. I mean, the list goes on and on. You even have the global head of brand marketing for YouTube, Netta Gross, was a satellite officer in the Israeli military, and also in the role of product specialist for music at YouTube is Asaf Sheikh, who was a member of combat intelligence for the Israeli military. Now, Alan, just to start off this question of Google and quite how interlinked really the US government, you know, like you pointed out with our friend Aaron Berman before, you know, this was literally someone briefing the president of the United States, now in this very important position of literally deciding what content is allowed on the platform. Well, you actually seemingly have a similar setup at Google, where somebody by the name of Christy Canigalo also has an interesting crossover with President Obama and the White House and Google. Could you tell us a bit about Christie, please?
Yeah, sure. So the article you're referencing is called National Security Search Engine. Google's ranks are filled with CIA agents. Now, Christy Canigalo is not a CIA agent, but she does have a similar long relationship, professional history with the US national security state. She was at one point President Barack Obama's deputy White House chief of staff for implementation, and was also chief of staff to the Department of Homeland Security as well. She, at one point, though, was the head of Google's Trust and Safety division. She was the vice president of Trust and Safety at Google, and she was essentially deciding what content would be allowed on her platform to billions of people. Now, we're talking about Twitter or Reddit or Facebook. These sorts of platforms are extremely influential, but ultimately, if you're not on them, you can more or less ignore them if you want. Unfortunately, Google's really not like that. It is just too ubiquitous now in modern life. There is really no way to avoid Google. And unfortunately, Google has very much the same sort of relationship with the US security state as Facebook does, as that we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes or so. There are dozens of employees who spent time at the CIA who are now at Google or later went on to Google. And I just lay out what I found through some quite simple database searches, listing just the sort of people who now have pretty senior positions at Google. Again, very few of these are in politically neutral areas like customer service or anything like that, or sales. It's mostly in politicized positions where you can actually influence the content and reach of Google. And of course, as pretty much everyone in alternative media knows, Google really decides whether you live and die. So in 2017, overnight, Google changed its algorithms supposedly to promote authoritative content. But the main thing that happened was that high-quality alternative news websites suffered catastrophic declines. So, for instance, Democracy Now! Lost 36% of its readership overnight from Google search traffic. Sites like Alternet lost 63%. Mint Press lost even more than 63%, getting quite close on to 90% of its Google search traffic, just from one decision that was implemented. And this was all in the face of the idea that Russian fake news stole the election and that we have to really change our entire internet to defend against that. But of course, who are they bringing in to defend us from that? It's exactly the sorts of people who most individuals would actually say are bigger threats to our safety and our sanity online. And that's people from the US three-letter organizations such as the CIA, FBI, etc. So like one example is Jacqueline Looper, who spent more than 10 years at the CIA, where she was, in her own words, a leading US government expert on security challenges in the Middle East and the go-to writer for needed papers for the US president. In 2017, she joined Google and is currently a senior intelligence collection and trust and safety manager there. So these are the sorts of people who are intermingled within the most important areas of Google, who are purporting to try and keep us safe. But frankly, when you start looking at their backgrounds, I feel much less safe knowing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And at that time when sort of Project Owl was put in place, and the effects were massive on a platform like Mint Press, you have to remember that Jeff Lazarus, for example, who'd been a political analyst at the CIA, was a policy advisor for trust and safety at Google. And specifically, he had been working on this issue of extremist content. So it is entirely possible that the very levers of sort of invisibilization or minimizing the reach of journalists like yourself and others was being carried out by people who had literally walked out of the door of the CIA and walked into the door of Google. So it's quite incredible when you think about it. Alan, you've also pointed out that the intelligence and security teams at Google seem to draw upon the national security state. Could you just outline for us some of those individuals who are now supposedly working in security at Google?
Well, I guess one example would be Brian Weisbard. You mentioned him before. He's the director of trust and safety. He basically works on YouTube mostly. He led teams that adjudicated the most sensitive YouTube trust and safety escalations, in his own words, and in his own words again, enforced the most urgent and highest priority misinformation and sensitive content decisions. End quote. But again, between 2006 and 2010, he was actually an intelligence officer at the CIA. And now, since his role at Google, he's now moved on to become a director at Facebook. So again, we've got this synergy, this, as you said, a revolving door between Silicon Valley and these three-letter agencies in the outskirts of Washington, D.C. There's plenty of people in that article you can go through. One of the intelligence analyst leads in trust and safety at YouTube is Michelle Torabowski. Again, she left a 12-year CIA political and leadership analyst profession to go to Google in 2019 to take up that position. As I said, you can go through the article yourself and just look at how many people have taken this career path. But I do also want to say that Google is a little bit different to some of the other groups that we've been talking about in another way. And that's because really, from even before its inception, it was really being midwifed by the CIA. What do I mean by that? I mean that the research that eventually ended up becoming Google by Sergey Brin at the University of Stanford was actually being overseen by a CIA agent at the time who was pushing him in various different directions. And there's even some evidence to suggest that it was even being paid for at the time. The CIA actually held shares in Google until 2005. A lot of people don't know the CIA has a venture capitalist firm called In-Q-Tel. The Q, by the way, for anyone interested, does stand, it is a reference to the Q character in James Bond, the man who creates all these crazy gadgets that the spy uses to get himself out of like all sorts of tough situations. And the whole point of In-Q-Tel is to try to work with fledgling startup businesses, whether it's in tech or whether it's in, well, it can be in any real field. But the point is that they try and nurture these groups to try to provide them the best quality high-tech gadgets or information or services to keep the CIA and other three-letter organizations in the United States 2 or 3 steps ahead of the rest of the world. And so ultimately, really from its very beginnings, Google has at least had its hand held by the CIA, which I think to a lot of people will be a very surprising finding, because they certainly don't advertise that. In fact, they present themselves as this sort of like, slightly edgy, fair company which has very progressive values. For many years, even had the slogan "Don't be evil." But once they started moving into being active military contractors, another thing that a lot of people don't know, Google is a big military contractor, as is Amazon and the these big tech companies. They're making billions of dollars off of new contracts with various groups within the military or various intelligence agencies as well. These groups really started to abandon any sort of progressive ideals that they at least talked about, to the point where Google actually had a revolt among its staff a couple of years ago. The staff were aghast about how deeply intertwined the Google management saw their future when it came to the military-industrial complex. And there's been this kind of tug of war silently within Google ever since.
Yeah, absolutely. Recently, you have had again, uh, the situation of the Israeli military being able to place adverts on the videos of pro-Palestinian YouTubers prior to those videos playing. Now, those videos have set out what is the Israeli government's view on the war in Gaza. It happened in 2021. There was a backlash from Muslim YouTubers. It's happened again in 2022. What you've seen, though, also is a sort of strike breaking policy whereby those people posting about Google's relationship with Israel will be contacted from an employee within Google saying, "We hear what you have to say, we see you, we hear you, we're listening, and we'd just like to take your opinion so we can feed it back into the system." Well, unfortunately, Whitney Webb found that there was at least 28 former employees of the Israeli military intelligence unit 8200 currently working in Google. Now, for Unit 8200, for those who don't know, it is the signal communications unit. It's the equivalent of GCHQ. It has a very, very wide access to all Palestinian electronic communications. Whistleblowers from within Unit 8200 have actually come out and claimed that that information is being used to blackmail Palestinians into becoming collaborators. For instance, if some form of information is known about personal relationships, that will be brought forward to Palestinians. They will be confronted with that and told, um, if you don't do what we want you to do or give us some information that we are seeking, we will make sure this information is known and you will be scandalized off the back of it. Now, this is basically the information, the omnipotent information infrastructure, which lurches over the seizure of Palestinian land. Now, in addition to that, not only Google, but Amazon have this Project Nimbus deal with the Israeli government and military, which actually has within it a sort of anti-BDS clause, which would prevent Google and Amazon from pulling out of the deal due to popular pressure. The campaign that the Israelis have led to stave off BDS in the big tech field is quite considerable. So, for instance, you also have Paul Singer, who is a key Republican donor, one of the biggest donors to the Republican Party, and through Elliott Management, which is his organization, also funds the Conservative Party here. Paul Singer has set up something called Startup Nation Central. Now, the purpose of Startup Nation Central is to combat BDS by feeding former Unit 8200 employees into big tech companies. In addition to that, also to move big tech jobs over to occupied Palestine, as they call Israel. Now, this is the kind of the infrastructure that we're talking about here. And you have seen, as you stated, Alan, a response from Google employees. So you have seen, thank you very much, Manar, for pointing out this brilliant article by Whitney Webb on Paul Singer's organization, Startup Nation Central. You should check that out on the Mint Press website. But, as you said, Alan, this hasn't taken place without some sort of opposition from employees within Google. You saw them in 2021 on the verge of a walkout. And it's also important to remember when you're pointing out all of this stuff about connections, very clear connections with the US national security state, that just last year it was reported that Google deleted more than 2,500 YouTube channels, which were supposedly tied to China as part of its efforts to weed out disinformation, as they said. However, those channels generally posted spammy, non-political content. A small subset touched on politics. So what you're actually saying is that Google basically engaged in a racist cleansing witch hunt of YouTube channels, the vast majority of which were not political, and cleansed them from the site. Alan, What else do you think it is important for people to know generally about this crossover of the big tech sector and the national security state?
Well, I think we've covered a lot, but even basically at some point, a tech company, social media platform seems to get to the point where it becomes too big to be ignored or too influential to the point where the United States government tends to put the hammer down and tries to influence them. We saw this with Reddit. We've seen this with, as we talked about, Facebook before. We also saw it in 2020 with TikTok, for instance, whereby the Trump administration started making a lot of noise about deleting TikTok entirely from the US market because it was controlled by the Communist Party. And then suddenly in late 2020, that sort of chat just went away. It really surprised a lot of people, not least people like Bill Gates, whose organization, Microsoft, had actually come up with a deal to buy TikTok from its Chinese parent company. But what happened is that since 2020, TikTok has been hiring an awful lot of people from NATO. And so ultimately, I think this sort of infiltration starts happening again. The United States government, whether it's through letter organizations or through the military or whatever, has constantly tried to control the means of communication worldwide, whether that means literally starting newspapers in dozens of countries that purport to be independent but are in fact front groups for US ideas and US outlook on the world, or whether it's feeding information to journalists or infiltrating media outlets to the point where in the 1970s, the Church Commission found that there were over 400 CIA agents working in newsrooms across the United States. But now, really, the means of communication has gone online to the point where I think we have to stop talking about having privacy or any sort of like control over our own data. I think we have to start being very careful about what we say, even to the point where we have to start thinking about methods of communication which are not digital, because ultimately even things like Signal or apps that purport to be totally safe, ultimately they have backdoors around them to the point where I think, yeah, we have to start really talking about privacy very seriously and to start really mistrusting the devices that are being put in our screens, whether it's a television or a laptop or your phone, or even nowadays in all sorts of things like your doorbell. I think we have to really start thinking about the new digital technologies that we all enjoy as being at best a mixed blessing.
Yeah, I think one of the amazing things that WikiLeaks revealed, which actually wasn't very well publicized, was a CIA program by the name of Weeping Angel. Now, this program basically developed ways in which smart TVs could be used to listen in on conversations that happened around them, essentially turning TVs into listening devices and microphones to be used against the people that own them. You also had them exploring hacking into cars and crashing them, allowing what they called nearly undetectable assassinations. You know, these sound like conspiracy theories, but they are very well they're documented. I wouldn't say well documented, but they are documented, and they are existing programs. You know, as someone that once was accosted by a journalist off the basis with a false accusation, off the basis of something that they'd seen on Reddit, I have a keen understanding of quite how powerful and important Reddit is as a website. Now, I believe that you've looked into some of the connections between Reddit and the US security state. If you could just walk me through a little bit of that just to finish off the show, please, Alan.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess Reddit is a little bit different to a lot of the platforms we're talking about here. It really, for many, many years, had a very sort of outsider aura to it, to the point where it was actually getting in trouble with a lot of the authorities. You may remember that one of the founders of Reddit was Aaron Swartz, who was involved in the campaign to try and liberate information from the clutches of groups like JSTOR and these academic corporations who really control a lot of the world's knowledge, a lot of the world's scientific output, trying to put these journals out there freely for everybody to read. But in recent years, it really has changed its tone. And I think that really is, absolutely summed up in the appointment in 2017, a very strange appointment at the time of Jessica Ashu to become the director of policy at Reddit. Now, Ashu, if you look at her resume, her CV, it does not look like somebody who's working in tech. She, at the time, was a very hawkish Mandarin working for the Atlantic Council on the Middle East, and again, in particular, Syria and counterinsurgency there. Before that, she'd also worked for the government of the UAE. Her boss was an Emirati Air Force general, and it was clear that she was actually coordinating the Western response to the Syrian civil war alongside the Emiratis. And if you start putting two and two together, you start getting some very worrying things, knowing, as we do, for instance, that on the subject of Syria, Al-Qaeda was on the US side, in the words of Jake Sullivan, in a famous email the National Security Advisor sent to Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time. He said, Al-Qaeda is on our side. And so ultimately, with this dirty war going on, this is really where she was cutting her teeth. She certainly looked like somebody who was trying to make a career in either big think tanks or in the Secretary of Defense's office or something. So it really did raise eyebrows when she was appointed the director of policy for Reddit. And Reddit really changed very quickly under her leadership. It had been a very sort of anarchistic place where anything went, but she came in, immediately started banning communities. Over 100 were banned on one day, in fact. Certain websites were blocked from being shared at Reddit, including Mint Press. And so it's a similar story whereby the platform is cleaned up, it's made nice for corporate advertisers to come in, but it's also kind of become sort of politically neutered to the point where it's not really a place for organizing or really truly finding out a lot of information, simply because what you're being offered really differs not very much to what you might get anywhere else. And that's a real shame, actually.
Fantastic, Alan. Thank you so much. And before we finish, I think it's important we mention Selma Shihab, who was a Leeds University PhD student. She has just been given a 34-year prison sentence in Saudi Arabia for using Twitter. Now, the irony in this is, of course, that Twitter is at least partially owned by people of prominence in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, this was somebody who is bearing this 34 years in prison, a mother of two, merely for retweeting people, which the Saudi government finds completely irredeemable. So there we have really one of the most harsh manifestations of this policing of expression that can happen through social media sites. It's been a really brilliant episode of The Watchdog, where we watch the watchers. I would just like to thank Alan MacLeod again and encourage everyone who is watching this to check out Alan's stuff, to follow him on Twitter, to follow him on Instagram, where he is, of course, extra funny. He came today without his fringe, which was a great disappointment to me personally, but it's okay because I'm a great fan. So I would just say, please support Alan. Please support Mint Press in what we do. There is just not enough seriously critical and confrontational investigative journalism happening today. Thank you for joining us.
Cheers, my pleasure.